Hey people, it's NIyas713. Now this is Black History, the Zanj Revolt. So this is from medievalist.net. The Zanj Revolt, a slave war in medieval Iraq. After generations of oppression, an army of slaves rose up to challenge the Abbasid Caliphate. The Zanj Revolt was a major slave uprising against the Abbasid Caliphate that took place in the marshlands of southern Iraq, al-Batai, and southern Iran, al-Ahwaz, during the 9th century. Between the years 869-883, rebel slaves defeated several armies sent against them by the authorities, created an independent polity for themselves when a capital, al-Muqtara, deep in the marshes, struck their own coins, and at the peak of their own power, expanded their territory to include all of southern Iraq and parts of central Iraq, sacking major cities such as Basra and Wasit. It took a campaign that lasted several years and the commitment of significant military resources and personnel to finally defeat them and end the rebellion. Not since the servile wars of the Roman era had there been a slave uprising against an imperial power of the magnitude that engulfed Iraq during the Zanj Rebellion. Slavery in most of the Islamic world differed quite significantly to its counterpart in the West. Most slaves who entered the caliphate found themselves in the urban centers of the caliphate, serving the households of merchants, dignitaries, nobles, and rulers. These slaves fulfilled a number of tasks, including household chores such as cooking, cleaning, fetching water, providing skilled labor. Carpenters, blacksmiths, jewelers worked as administrators and representatives in their master's business, ran the administration of the government, served as soldiers and bodyguards, and as concubines in their harems. Sometimes these slaves gained their freedom and became integrated into their new society. Some were emancipated, while others were able to buy their freedom through the money they earned from their work. For example, a slave working as a blacksmith was required to pay his master a fixed amount of money every week, and any surplus he earned were the wages he used to maintain himself and to eventually buy his freedom. Slavery was sometimes also one of the few ways for upward social mobility in the medieval Muslim world. Those slaves that served as soldiers in the retinue of sultans and caliphs could rise through the ranks to become general viziers and in some cases establish their own kingdoms. Example, the Ghaznavid Empire and the Mamluk Sultanate. Concubines also rose to prominence if they were members of the royal harem. Qaizurun al-Mahdi, the third Abbasid Caliphate concubine, was second only to her husband when it came to wealth and power in the entire caliphate. In fact, her sons Al-Hadi and Harun al-Rashid were by their fathers to be his successors, despite him having a noble freeborn Arab wife who had borne him two older sons. However, such cases were relatively rare considering the huge numbers of slaves present in the Muslim world, and such social mobility was only possible for the relatively few who were the slaves of a ruler or important dignitary. There was a close interpersonal relationship between slave and master in this form of household slavery, and often close bonds were formed between them. Although there are numerous accounts of the mistreatment of slaves by their masters, it was generally in the interest of the master to treat his slaves well. I'm not exactly sure how true that is, but let's keep going. Or at least relatively well, and for a slave to serve their master and be loyal. This way, both parties benefited. In fact, the Kabus Name, an 11th century work in the genre of Persian advice literature, or Mirrors for Princes, advises the slave owner to sell his slave if he does not get along with him rather than punishing him harshly. This was especially the case regarding military slaves, who were the socio-military elites of the Islamic world for a millennium between the 9th century and 19th century. One need not think too hard on the outcome of mistreating or abusing these military slaves who formed the elites of the militaries of the Muslim world. If they felt threatened or offended by their master, military slaves killed them and sought service under a new master or formed their own polities. Mardavij ibn Zir, the Iranian condottiere and founder of the Ziyarid dynasty, Ahmad ibn Ismail, the ruler of the vast Samanid Empire, Turan Shah, the last Ayyubid Sultan of Egypt, and al-Mutawakkil, the 10th Abbasid Caliph, were all murdered by the slave soldiers whom they either mistreated, insulted, or threatened. Despite household slavery being the most prominent form of slavery in the Islamic world, plantation slavery, similar to that practiced in the Americas during the 16th and 19th century, was also practiced during the 9th century in southern Iraq. As we will see below, the slaves on these plantations were treated very differently to some of those described above. The geography of southern Iraq is dominated by the Euphrates and Tigris rivers, and vast marshlands result from the regular flooding of these rivers. The landscape was dominated by swampy, muddy terrain covered with growths of weed and rushes, often several meters tall and wide but shallow canals. These canals could only be navigated using flat-bottomed boats, making this region very inaccessible. The inhabitants of the marshes lived primarily as farmers. They tilled small plots of land, growing rice, barley, lentils, millet, sorghum, melons, watermelon, and onions. They kept buffalo, sheep, and cows and supplemented their diet with the abundant fish in the waters and various types of waterfowl such as gulls, wild ducks, and geese. There were also larger, more dangerous animals such as wild boars, leopards, jackals, wolves, lions, lynx, and wildcats that inhabited this marshy ecosystem. Perhaps the greatest scourge to the inhabitants and more so to outsiders were the swarms of mosquitoes, gnats, flies, and other insects that carried disease such as malaria. Due to the inhospitable terrain, the harsh living conditions, the insects and diseases, the population of the region went through a decline, especially after the Islamic conquest of the 7th century and the establishment of great urban centers in Iraq such as Basra, Kufa, Wasit, and Baghdad. Many of the inhabitants of the marshes migrated to these cities, which had become booming economic and intellectual centers by the 9th century in the hope of finding work and better lives. The marshes became abandoned deadlands due to the mass exodus of its inhabitants to the cities. The Abbasids took an interest in reclaiming this area and making it suited for agriculture. The law of the land stated that all one had to do to claim ownership of part of these marshes was to once again make the land agriculturally viable. These areas had become deadlands because layers of natron were deposited with topsoil due to the frequent flooding of the rivers in the region. These layers of natron had to be removed to reclaim these lands and make them agriculturally viable. Wealthy magnates and merchants, especially in the southern city of Basra, had the capital and political backing of the caliphs to claim these lands, clear them, and cultivate them using servile labor. Large numbers of Africans, mainly Bantu speaking from the east coast of Africa and Zanzibar, were purchased or captured and transported to southern Iraq as the main source of the manpower that was used to reclaim and cultivate the marshy regions. These slaves were the ones whom the sources referred to as the Zanj. The Zanj lived and worked in deplorable conditions. They had no direct contact with their masters who lived in the large urban centers of Iraq. Their contact with authority was through their overseers, who were usually very harsh and cruel to the slaves. Their work was back-breaking, scraping the natron layer off the top of the soil and transporting it on their backs or using mules and piloting giant mounds in order to prepare the land for cultivation. Along with the black slaves, local peasants who had remained in the marshes were also recruited for this task. These servile laborers were grouped in crowded camps of 500 to 5,000 individuals. In addition to the hard work and cruel treatment of the overseers, the Zanj were barely provided with the basic necessities for life. They were given little to no clothing, their shelters were cramped and did little to guard them from the elements or the biting insects, and they were barely given enough food to survive. Their form of slavery differs greatly from the domestic household slavery described earlier. Alexandra Popovich, the author of one of the few academic studies on this revolt, sums it up by saying, the situation is all the more striking since slavery in Islamic countries of the Middle Ages, contrary to slavery in Rome at the time of Spartacus, was essentially domestic servitude and not much employed for large rural projects. The conditions under which Zanj slaved were unquestionably unusual for medieval Muslim society. The terrible living conditions and the cruelty of the overseers definitely caused a great deal of discontent and rebelliousness among the Zanj. However, as the religion of their masters had pushed them over the edge. Through their contacts with Muslims in Iraq, many of the slaves started to learn about Islam and convert to the religion. Some of the earliest adherents of Islam and the Prophet Muhammad had been the slaves and downtrodden of Meccan society due to the promise of justice, equality, and brotherhood for all who embraced religion. In fact, one of the earliest sects of Islam, Kharijism, taught that even the lowliest of slaves could become the leader of their community based on his piety and merit. Furthermore, the Prophet's cousin, Ali ibn Abi Talib, also championed the cause of the downtrodden, and during the First Civil War, 656 to 661, there were 8,000 slaves and freedmen in his army of 60,000. Despite the conversion of thousands of Zanj to Islam, their condition did not improve. Their anger and discontent at the injustice done to them and the hypocrisy of the rulers and the elites of the caliphate grew. The great Zanj revolt that broke out in 869 was preceded by two smaller uprisings in the region. There was an insurrection in 689, 690. This was not an organized rebellion, involved gangs of angry slaves who pillaged and ransacked whatever they could get their hands on. They were easily defeated by an army sent from Basra. Those Zanj not killed in the fight were beheaded, and their bodies were gibbeted as example for others. The second revolt took place in 694 and seems to have been slightly more organized. It had a leader, Shir Zanj, Lion of the Zanj, and two expeditions to crush it. The second revolt was more dangerous because the Zanj seemed to have been stirred by propaganda or organized to a certain degree, which enabled them to defeat the punitive expedition sent against them. The oppressive apparatus of the rulers and slave masters seemed to have intensified up to this point, because for 2 centuries, sources are silent regarding the Zanj's political or military activities. It was not the arrival of Ali ibn Muhammad, a mysterious figure who managed to unite the Zanj and the other downtrodden elements of the society of southern Iraq and the marshes, that the Zanj rose up again. In this time, they succeeded in establishing an independent polity populated primarily by former slaves and indentured laborers, and formed a significant threat to the stability and economy of the caliphate. Ali ibn Muhammad is an obscure figure who appeared on the world stage suddenly. The historian Al-Tabari states that Ali claimed that his ancestor was Muhammad ibn Hakim from Kufa. His ancestor had participated in Zayd ibn Ali's Shiite uprising against the Umayyads in 740. When the revolt was defeated, he fled to Ray, near modern-day Tehran in Iran, and took up residence there. Ali's paternal grandfather moved back to Iraq and bore a concubine from Sindh, part of modern-day Pakistan, who bore him a son, Muhammad, who was Ali's father. He became associated with some of the courtiers of the Abbasid Caliph al-Muntasir and derived a living through them by praising them through poetic verses. In 863, he moved to Bahrain, which in the 9th century comprised a large region of what is eastern Arabia. There, Ibn Muhammad claimed a genealogy back to Ali ibn Abi Talib, the Prophet Muhammad's cousin and one of the revered imams of the Shiite sect of Islam. He immediately attracted a large following among the tribes in the region who regarded him as a prophet. Taxes were collected in his name and he ruled him as prophet, judge, and king. He claimed that one of the signs of his divine leadership was the verses of the Quran that he had never read before were revealed to him, and that he could recite them from memory despite never previously having seen or heard them. He and his followers fought against the forces of the Abbasid government and rival desert tribes. He lost one of the battles in which many of his followers were slain. With this defeat, he lost his charisma and credibility in the eyes of the Arab tribes, most of whom abandoned him. Ali ibn Muhammad, having failed in Bahrain and being tired of the desert, set out for Basra, where a few of his most loyal associates. At that time, there were some civil disturbances in Basra due to a conflict between two large tribal factions. Ali's goal was to exploit the chaos and to win the support of one of these groups. However, no one responded to his call and his representatives were dispersed by the soldiers of the local governor. After some of his companions were imprisoned, Ali fled from Basra only to be captured and imprisoned in Wasit. However, he was able to talk himself out of prison, a testament to his charisma and oratory skill, and made his way to Baghdad. In Baghdad, he gathered more supporters before heading south to Basra again. He did not enter the city for fear of being arrested, and it was in the outlying agricultural regions of Basra that he observed the Zanj and their poor living conditions. Ali and his band of supporters set up camp in the marshes and started to liberate the slaves. They initially ambushed small groups of 20 to 50 slaves who were lightly guarded as they were heading to work, killed or captured the overseers, and liberated their slaves. Soon, Ali had a considerable following of freed Zanj. He had convinced them that he was the right person to lead them. He vowed to them that he would be fair and just to them, and he would treat them with dignity, and he would never betray them. He also promised that he would grant them wealth and property, including slaves. It is important to note here that slave revolts such as Zanj rebellion, or the uprising led by Spartacus against the Romans, did not intend to abolish the institution of slavery, but rather to lift the rebels out of their status as slaves. Furthermore, in an ironic reversal of roles, the Zanj were given whips to beat the overseers and slave masters who had been captured during Ali's raids. As the ranks of his army swelled, Ali ibn Muhammad launched raids against the towns and villages in the vicinity of the marshes. He cleverly selected green and red to be the color of his banner. Green had always been the color of the Shiites, reinforcing his claim that he was a descendant of the Prophet's cousin. Red, on the other hand, was the color of the Kharijite sect and reinforced the egalitarian nature of his movement that promised his supporters equality and dignity. Initially, the rebels were very poorly equipped for war. Al-Tabari states that there were only 3 swords in the entire army at the beginning of the revolt. Most of the freed Zanj slaves used sticks, farming implements, and anything else they could get their hands on to fight. There are examples in the sources of Zanj using trays and trumpets to strike at the soldiers sent against them. The Battle of the Barges. Initially, the Caliph and his inner circle did not take the Zanj revolt seriously. In fact, the matter was relegated to the local governor and magnates in Basra. At this point, the Caliphate was dealing with threats on multiple fronts. In Egypt, the governor Ahmad ibn Tulun seceded and proclaimed his independence, an act that would wrest Egypt and parts of Syria from Abbasid control for several decades. At the same time, the Safarids in Sistan and Khorasan were directly challenging Abbasid authority and expanding towards western Iran and Iraq at an alarming rate. Due to the challenges which were deemed more important than a group of upstart slaves, the Abbasids did not initially pay much attention to the Zanj. Ali ibn Muhammad and his Zanj army, which was also joined by local peasants, scored a number of victories against the governor's forces and the mercenaries hired to suppress them. They successfully used the geography of the marshlands to their advantage, luring the enemies into traps and ambushes. With each victory, the Zanj captured weapons, boats, much needed supplies, and valuables. The rebels were merciless towards the soldiers sent to suppress them and to once again cast them into the shackles of slavery and behead any prisoner who fell into their hands. A good example of the Zanj tactics can be seen in the first major battle they fought against the Basrans. At the Battle of the Barges, 2 months into the rebellion in 869, the rebels who had made a premature attack on Basra and had been forced back laid an ambush for the pursuing Basran army composed of volunteers. The Basrans advanced along a canal were met by a detachment of the Zanj army, which had been divided into three parts. The upper two sections of the Zanj forces were hidden in the reeds along the banks of the canal and allowed the Basrans to pass, and to only attack when they engaged the Zanj forces facing them. The result was an overwhelming Zanj victory and the almost complete annihilation of the Basran army. The Zanj victory at the Battle of the Barges got the Abbasids' attention. They sent a detachment of Turkish troops to deal with the Zanj. However, these troops did not make much headway despite being excellent soldiers and cavalrymen. The Turks found it difficult to negotiate the swampy terrain. After a daring night raid on their camp, these elite government troops were also driven out of the marshes and forced to make a tactical withdrawal to Basra. Over the next 2 years, the Zanj defeated another army sent against them, and in 870 they successfully blockaded Basra. After a year of blockade, the city fell to the Zanj, who exacted a dreadful revenge against its inhabitants, who they blamed for the injustice and cruelties they had suffered. Wealthy men were tortured to reveal the location of their hidden wealth, and to the horror of the people of the Caliphate, women and children were carried away to become slaves for the Zanj in their new capital, the Marsh al-Muqtara. According to the al-Masudi, who lived a few decades after the revolt ended, 300,000 of Basra's inhabitants were massacred after the city fell. However, this number seems rather high, and most scholars agree that around 10,000 to 20,000 of Basra's inhabitants were killed during the sack of Basra. The fall and pillaging of Basra was such a serious blow to the Abbasids that the Caliph's own brother al-Muwafiq personally led an army to fight the Zanj. After some initial successes, his forces were defeated in battle, and he was forced to withdraw due to disease, lack of supplies, and constant attacks launched by the rebels. For the next several years, the rebels took the offensive. They defeated every army sent against them and suffered few reverses. By 879, the territory controlled by the rebels reached its furthest extent. It consisted most of southern Iraq and Awaz, including the major cities of this region such as Rum, Hormuz, Ubulu, and Wasit. The successes were so great that by this year they managed to advance to less than 50 miles from Baghdad. The Abbasid government took the initiative once again at the end of 879. Al-Muwaffaq and his son, the future Caliph al-Mu'tadid, led a large and well-equipped army against the Zanj. On all fronts, they pushed the rebels back into the swamps so that by 881 they had contained them in and around the capital, Al-Muqtara. Al-Muqtara would fall after 2 years. The Zanj put up a stiff resistance, making the Abbasid forces pay heavily for every step that they advanced into their capital as they fought both the enemy and the inhospitable environment of the swamps. Although victory seemed inevitable at this point, Al-Muwaffaq realized that force alone would not bring the revolt to an end quickly enough. To end the fighting more quickly and to cut the cost of the campaign, both in lives and resources, he offered amnesty and a place in his army to any of the rebels willing to defect to his side. By giving the rebels this choice, Al-Muwaffaq also gained a valuable new contingent of soldiers who were very adept at fighting in the marshes and whose assistance was instrumental in striking the death blow to Ali ibn Muhammad and those among the rebels who remained loyal to him. So once again, traitors have dealt a huge blow to a black freedom movement. By August 883, al-Muqtara failed the Abbasids. Ali ibn Muhammad fell in the battle as he and his loyal supporters were surrounded and cut down. His head was raised on a pike and displayed for all to see, especially those Zanj who had continued resisting the Abbasid. After this point, thousands of Zanj streamed to the Abbasid camp. Al-Muwaffaq granted them all amnesty due to the large number, the prowess, and also because he realized that he punished them other elements of Zanj army still at large in the marshes would continue to fight and be a menace to the Caliphate. Although the rebellion was finally crushed after almost 15 years of fighting, its consequences were to haunt the Abbasids until the fall of their caliphate in 1258. The fighting and pillaging that took place during the conflict greatly devastated the agricultural lands of southern Iraq, which resulted in a major decrease in the revenues that went to the royal treasury. The revenue also disrupted the economic activities in the region, and combined with the decrease in agriculture, some regions were hit with serious food shortages and famine. The declines in revenue greatly weakened the caliphs, and their sphere of influence continued to shrink until they only wielded direct political authority over Baghdad and its immediate environs. In fact, the resources and manpower that had to be diverted against the Zanj resulted in the loss of Abbasid control over significant parts of the caliphate. The loss of life was also heavy, with sources reporting that the death toll anywhere between 500,000 to 2.5 million. As in most such cases, the sources tend to be biased and inaccurate when it comes to numbers. However, considering the length of the revolt and the almost constant state of fighting and raiding that took place during the years 869 to 883, it would not be an exaggeration to put the estimate of the death toll in the tens or even hundreds of thousands. Another important consequence of the Zanj revolt was that never again would we see the implementation of mass agricultural plantation slavery on a large scale in the Muslim world after the failure of this experiment in southern Iraq. Although the Zanj revolt was a destructive and violent episode in the history of the Abbasid Caliphate, It highlights the struggle of a group of people from the lowest, poorest, and most unjustly treated echelons of society against one of the most powerful empires of that age. Despite the odds being stacked against them, these rebel slaves and the charismatic leader were able to establish and maintain a polity in the marshes while under constant attack for a decade and a half, which is no small feat. So there you have it. For all those people who keep saying slaves just accepted their lot, that's not true. People have African people, black people have fought for freedom everywhere in the world where they were oppressed. In America, Jamaica, Haiti, South America, Africa, the Middle East, and anywhere else you care to name. They have always fought for freedom, and we honor those who brave martyrs who gave their lives for freedom. Anyway, I'm going to leave this article in the description. If you'd like to support this channel, leave my GoFundMe in the description. If you'd like to follow me on Instagram, I'll leave it there as well. If you'd like to buy one of my t-shirts, I'll leave that there as well. Peace.